I have been doing intake processing on HFY for 22 years. In that time, I have processed 114,000 individual welfare cases, logged 3.2 million form fields, and consumed enough strong tea to irrigate a small agricultural moon. I have seen every category of arrival that the Vethali Intake Directorate has a form for, and several it does not. I have been awarded the division's merit commendation 4 times, twice for accurate filing under difficult conditions, once for locating a missing classification subcategory that turned out to have been misfiled in 2031, and once in what the commendation itself described as exceptional judgment under procedurally ambiguous circumstances, for a situation I will describe shortly. I want to be clear that I did not do anything exceptional. I gave a child something to eat. I poured a cup of tea for her mother. I did my job, which I have been doing for 22 years, and my job sometimes involves sitting with someone who is frightened and making sure they are not more frightened than they need to be. That is not exceptional. That is Tuesday. The commendation is framed on my wall, and I appreciate it. But I do think the Directorate was filling out paperwork they felt they owed someone, and I happened to be the nearest person. Vethali arrived at HFY on a Tuesday in the 7th cycle of the Federation Standard Year, at 14:23 by the station clock. She had a child with her. The child was, I estimated, approximately 5 or 6 in Federation Standard, though Vethali developmental scaling makes precise estimation difficult for a non-specialist. She was carrying a bag that was too heavy for her and making no complaint about it. They came through the secondary access corridor, which is the one that serves incoming transit vessels on the lower docking tier. Most of my Tuesday afternoons come through the primary corridor, which has better lighting and an automated greeting panel, and 3 separate scanning stations with cheerful instructional graphics that have not been updated since 2019 and still show Federation species that were reclassified in 2023. The secondary corridor has a bench, a potted plant that I have been watering for 11 years because no one else will, and me. I was at my desk when they came in. The mother stopped in the doorway for a moment. She was tall, as Vethali tend to be, with the narrow shoulder line and the long secondary facial plates that indicate a Sareth lineage. The plates were held very still, which I have learned over the years usually means controlled distress rather than calm. She had good quality clothing. Once you could tell by the tailoring at the shoulder joints and the weight of the fabric, but it had been worn a long time and washed in circumstances that hadn't been kind to it. She was carrying 2 bags. The child, pressed close to her mother's side, was carrying a third, and looking at me with the large amber gold eyes that Vethali children have, and not looking away. I have learned in 22 years not to make quick assumptions about what a person coming through either corridor needs most. Sometimes it is documentation help. Sometimes it is a referral to medical. Sometimes it is simply that they need to sit down in a room where no one is asking them to leave, and everything else comes after that. "Good afternoon," I said. "Please come in and sit down. Can I get you something to drink?" The mother looked at me for a moment. Then she said, in careful Federation Standard with a Vethali accent that placed her origin somewhere in the inner system transit zones, "We do not have valid transit documentation." "I can see that," I said. "Sit down anyway. The documentation can wait a few minutes." She sat. The child sat next to her, still holding the bag, still watching me. The bag made a small sound when she set it down, something packed tightly, shifting. I made 3 cups of tea. My kettle is a personal appliance that I brought from home, because the station's communal kitchen is on the other side of the primary processing floor, and I have found over 22 years that the time it takes to walk there and back is usually time that someone is sitting on the bench waiting to find out whether they should be frightened, and I prefer to keep that time short. I put a plate of biscuits on the small table next to the bench. I brought 2 cups to the bench and set them down within reach. I went back to my desk with the 3rd cup and picked up my intake form. I'm Petra, I said. I'm the welfare intake officer for this sector of the station. I need to ask you some questions and I want you to take as long as you need with each one. There's no hurry. I paused. What is your name? Velsorath Rennick, she said. And the child's name? Velsorath Min. She said it quietly, with a particular careful steadiness, and the child looked up at her name and then back at me. Hello, Min, I said. Min considered this for a moment. Then she reached out, took one of the biscuits from the plate, and ate it with the deliberate focus of a child who has not eaten recently but has been taught to eat slowly. I noted this and did not comment on it. I began the intake form. The standard Velsorath intake and welfare form, version 14.3, has 47 fields. It covers identity verification, transit documentation status, prior Federation contact history, reason for arrival at the station, immediate welfare needs, medical status, housing and financial situation, and several pages of classification subcategory questions that exist because at some point in the Directorate's 400-year history, someone decided that the appropriate response to a situation that didn't fit the existing categories was to add more categories. Supplement 7 alone, which was added in the 41st cycle, has 23 subcategory options. Supplement 7, revised, added 6 more. I have filled out this form, or versions of it, approximately 114,000 times. I can do it in my sleep, and have come close on overnight shifts. I began with Field 1, which is name, already answered. Field 2, species. Field 3, lineage tier. Field 4, origin station or planet. Field 5, current documentation status. Field 6 through 14, prior Federation contact and transit permit history. Velsorath Rennick answered each field accurately, promptly, and completely. Her Federation standard was careful and precise, with the kind of deliberate word choice that comes from someone who has been speaking it as a second language for long enough to trust it, but not long enough to be careless with it. She made no attempt to obscure anything or provide incomplete information. She answered exactly what was asked and waited for the next question. Between questions, she kept her hands still in her lap, not rigid still. The stillness of someone who has spent time in rooms where movement that isn't asked for can be interpreted as anxiety or evasion, and who has learned to be careful. I have learned in 22 years to read stillness the same way I read form answers, accurately, and without adding interpretation that isn't there. Velsorath Rennick's stillness was the stillness of someone managing a great deal under pressure who was managing it extremely well. That is what I noted. I noted it in my working log rather than in the form, because the form does not have a field for that kind of observation, which is one of its limitations. Min ate a second biscuit. She had stopped watching me with the direct amber scrutiny of the first few minutes and was now looking at the room in the quiet, cataloging way that children look at new places when they have been in a lot of new places and know the value of understanding them quickly. She looked at the desk, the filing cabinet, the small window that looks out onto the docking tier approach, the potted plant, and then back at the biscuit plate. Then she ate the second biscuit. Fields 15 through 21 covered medical status and immediate welfare needs. I noted, in the welfare needs field, what I had already noted, which was that both the child and her mother showed signs of having gone without regular meals for some time, and that the mother's controlled plate posture suggested exhaustion she was not going to mention. I wrote this in the field without making anything of it aloud, because in my experience people who have been managing on very little tend to find it easier to have those things noted quietly than to have them named and discussed. Then I reached Field 22. Field 22 asks for reason for arrival at the station. It is usually brief. It is usually some version of one of the standard categories: transit documentation renewal, medical referral, family reunification, employment relocation, temporary shelter request. In 22 years, I have seen perhaps 40 variants. Velsareth Rennick's answer to Field 22 was accurate, prompt, and complete, and was none of those things. She was traveling to this station, she said, because this was the last operating intake point within range of her vessel's fuel capacity, and her vessel's fuel capacity was at 7%. She had been attempting to file a welfare intake and transit permission request at stations in this sector for the past 3 cycles, with the purpose of re-registering her family's transit corridor access following the corridor reclassification of the 43rd cycle. 17 stations had declined to process the request. 4 had processed an initial filing and then returned it incomplete. 3 had issued provisional transit clearances that were subsequently revoked when the Directorate classification desk reviewed them. She had been doing this for 3 cycles. That was, by Federation standard reckoning, approximately 11 months. I wrote this in Field 22, accurately and completely. Then I moved to Field 23, which asks for the name and contact details of any Federation sponsor or guarantor. She had none. She wrote this calmly in the same register she had used for every other answer. I finished the remaining fields. I looked at what I had. I am going to be precise about what I thought, which was, this form is correctly completed, every field has an accurate answer, and I cannot identify a classification pathway for it in the subcategory index, including Supplement 7, revised. This is a situation I have encountered perhaps 6 times in 22 years, and in all 6 previous instances, the case turned out to have a pathway I had missed rather than one that genuinely did not exist. I reviewed the subcategory index, including Supplement 7, revised. There was no pathway. I also noted, reading Field 22 again, the name of the transit corridor. The Velsareth 7 corridor reclassification of the 43rd cycle was something I knew about, because I read the Directorate bulletins and had read the ones covering the reclassification and the subsequent dispute. I recognized, reading Field 22, that what Velsareth Rennick was describing was a welfare intake case that was also, at its root, an 11-year unresolved administrative dispute involving 4,000 family vessels and 1 military reclassification order, and that this was why there was no classification pathway for it in the index, because the index had not been updated to accommodate a dispute that was still formally classified as under review and had been for 11 years. I made a note of this in my working log. Then I picked up my station communicator and sent a preliminary filing notification to the Directorate's intake assessment desk, flagged category undetermined, with a note that a full form was attached and that I was awaiting guidance on classification. Then I went to the kitchen at the end of the secondary corridor and made another pot of tea and came back with more biscuits. Min had eaten 3 of the original biscuits. She had moved slightly, angling herself toward the plate, the bag no longer in her lap. When I set the new plate down, she looked at her mother, and her mother said something in Vethali that I didn't catch, and Min took 1 biscuit and began eating it with the same deliberate focus. "Are you hungry?" I asked Velsareth Rennick. She looked at me. She looked at the new biscuits. Then she said, "Yes," which cost her something to say. I recognized the register. It is the register of someone who has spent enough time not saying that to find it difficult to start. I went back to the kitchen and found what I had, which was a container of leftover rice from my lunch, some dried fruit from my desk drawer, a small block of the pressed seed cake that Benedict Sorensen-Lau, my colleague on the adjacent shift, leaves in the kitchen because he says it keeps better in the cool, and 3 more biscuits. I put it on a plate and brought it back. Velsareth Rennick ate without hurrying. Min finished her biscuit and looked at the plate, and her mother gave her a piece of the dried fruit, and then ate the rest of the seed cake herself in small, deliberate bites, keeping her hand steady. I sat at my desk and waited for the Directorate to respond to my preliminary filing, and completed my shift administrative log, and watered the potted plant, which had been looking slightly pale at the edges and appreciated the attention. At 15:47, a response arrived from the intake assessment desk. It was a correction memo. It informed me that my preliminary filing had been received, that the category undetermined flag was not a recognized filing category for welfare intake cases and should not be used in this field, that I should please review the classification subcategory index including Supplement 7, revised, and select the appropriate intake pathway from the available options, and that the form could not be accepted for processing in its current state. I read this memo. I reread the classification subcategory index, including Supplement 7, revised methodically from the beginning. There was still no pathway. I sent a reply acknowledging receipt of the correction memo, noting that I had reviewed the classification subcategory index, including Supplement 7, revised, and was not able to identify a subcategory that accurately applied to this case without misrepresenting the content of one or more completed fields, and requesting direct assessment support from a senior intake officer. I sent this at 15:51 and flagged it priority. While I waited, I refilled Vel Sareth Renek's tea. She thanked me in Vethali, and I caught the courtesy form if not the specific word. Min had finished the dried fruit and was looking at the potted plant with the focused attention of someone making a decision about it. I told her the plant was called a corridor fern, that I had been watering it for 11 years, and that it appreciated being looked at but preferred not to be touched. Min considered this and then nodded once, seriously, as though filing the information away. At 16:12, Senior Intake Assessor Velketh Sareth Ren arrived at the secondary corridor. She was approximately my age, with the formal plate position that Keth Sareth senior assessors maintain during evaluation visits, and she carried a tablet loaded with what appeared to be 3 separate versions of the classification subcategory index, including at least one I didn't recognize, which may have been a draft of a revision not yet in general circulation. She looked at my desk, at the intake form, at Vel Sareth Renek and Min, who were still on the bench. Min had fallen asleep against her mother's side, still holding the now empty biscuit plate loosely in her lap. Velketh Sareth Ren sat at the secondary assessment station, which is the desk across from mine that gets used when I have overflow volume or a case that requires 2 officers. She reviewed my form in full. She reviewed the classification subcategory index on her tablet. She asked Vel Sareth Renek 4 clarifying questions, which Vel Sareth Renek answered accurately, promptly, and completely. She asked a 5th question, paused, and then asked it again in slightly different phrasing, as if hoping a different entry point might produce a different answer. It did not. At 17:03, Velketh Sareth Ren stood up from the secondary assessment station, picked up her tablet, and said to me, in a voice that I would describe as carefully controlled professional composure, "I'm going to need to escalate this." "I thought you might," I said. "The form is accurately completed," she said, as though this were itself an unexpected development. "It is," I said. She left. I made more tea. At 17:31, 2 additional assessors arrived from the Directorate's Classification Review Unit, which handles cases that senior assessors cannot categorize independently. They were brisk and systematic in the way of people who handle difficult cases regularly, and do not expect this one to be different. They set up at the secondary assessment station and the overflow chair, arranged their tablets in the configuration that classification review uses when they want everything accessible simultaneously, and reviewed my form, the correction memo, and Velketh Sareth Ren's escalation notes without speaking to me beyond a brief acknowledgement. They read the same subcategory index I had read. Then they read Supplement 7, revised. Then one of them pulled up what appeared to be an internal draft document that I couldn't read from my desk. They asked Vel Sareth Renek 11 clarifying questions. The questions were precise and technically detailed, covering documentation chain of custody, vessel registration history. The specific permit category invalidated in the 43rd cycle reclassification, and the exact language used by each of the 17 prior stations in their rejection communications. Velsareth Rennick produced a folded set of documents from her bag for several of these, physical paper, which is uncommon enough that both assessors paused when she unfolded them. She had kept copies of everything, every rejection, every filing, every provisional clearance that had subsequently been revoked. The paper was worn at the folds from being handled many times. She answered all 11 questions accurately, promptly, and completely. They conferred in low voices for some time. I couldn't hear the specifics. I noted in my working log that the classification review assessment was ongoing and returned to my shift administrative backlog. Min woke up during the second assessor's 5th question, came awake with the quick clarity of someone who has learned to orient fast in unfamiliar rooms, looked at the assessors with clear amber eyes, and then looked at her mother. Her mother put a hand on her shoulder. Min leaned back against her and watched the assessors with a calm that was, I thought, not so much the equanimity of childhood as the particular patience of a child, who has sat through a great many rooms of people asking the same questions, and has learned that the questions are not really for her, and that the waiting is simply part of it. At 18, 19, one of the classification review assessors stood up and said to the other one, not to me, "We need the chief classification officer." "He's off station until the 9th, the other one said. A pause. "Deputy, then." They gathered their materials and left. The secondary assessment station had 4 empty cups on it. I collected them. I looked at Velsareth Rennick. She was watching the door where the assessors had gone with an expression I had come to recognize over the previous few hours. It was not hope, exactly, or not only that. It was the expression of someone who has learned to hold hope at a particular careful distance so that the waiting does not become unbearable. "Are you all right?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We have been at 17 intake stations across 4 systems in the past 3 cycles. This is the first station that did not send us back at the first corridor." I didn't say anything to that. I got up and went to the kitchen and made tea from what was left of my supply, which was growing thin, and brought it back. When I returned, Min was standing at my desk. She was looking at the framed photograph I keep there, which is my daughter on her first day at the Navigation Academy, 8 years ago, holding her placement letter in both hands and smiling so wide it looks like it must have been almost painful. The photograph is not professionally framed. It is in a frame I bought from the station's common goods market for 3 credits, and it is slightly too large for the print, so there is a small gap of white at the bottom, but I have not replaced it because I stopped noticing it approximately 6 months after I put it there. "Is that yours?" Min asked, in Federation standard that was accented and careful. The way a child's second language is when they have been learning it seriously but not long enough to stop concentrating. "Yes," I said. "That's my daughter. She's a navigation officer now." Min looked at the photograph for a moment. "She looks happy," she said. "She was," I said. "She still is. Sit back down, please." Min sat back down. She folded her hands in her lap in the manner of someone who has been told, politely, to sit back down many times and has learned to do it with good grace. At 19:04, Deputy Chief Classification Officer Vel Sareth Kem arrived. He was older than the previous assessors, with the longer secondary plates of a senior administrative lineage and a plate tone that had the settled depth that comes with significant experience in work that matters. He had the expression of someone who has been called away from dinner, which I noted without comment, because the station clock said 19:04 and anyone who worked standard administrative hours would have had dinner interrupted. He reviewed my form, the correction memo, the escalation notes, and the classification review assessor's notes, which he read with the focused attention of someone looking for the place where someone else went wrong and not finding it. He read the classification subcategory index. He read Supplement 7, revised. He went back to the form. He asked Vethali 7 questions. They were different questions from any of the previous sets, not clarifying the facts of the case, which had been thoroughly clarified, but testing the edges. What options had she been offered at the 17 prior stations? Whether she had legal representation in the corridor dispute. Whether she had family at other stations. Whether the fuel situation had been reported to the Directorate's vessel distress monitoring system. He was, I understood, trying to find any alternate pathway that might exist adjacent to the one that didn't, any existing category that was close enough to apply without misrepresenting the case. Vethali answered all 7 accurately, promptly, and completely. The answer to the legal representation question was no. The answer to family at other stations was also no. The answer to the distress monitoring system was that she had filed twice and received no response. He was quiet for a long time after the 7th answer. Longer, I thought, than the content of the answer required. He was doing what the classification review assessors had been doing, looking for the adjacent pathway, and arriving at the same place they had arrived. Then he said to me rather than to her, "When did this case arrive?" 1423, I said. He looked at the station clock. It was 1917. You've been running standard welfare protocol for a case that doesn't have a classification pathway for nearly 5 hours, he said. She arrived during my shift, I said. The child needed to eat. The mother needed to sit down somewhere safe. Those things don't require a classification pathway. He looked at me for a moment. The expression I read on his face was not one I can categorize precisely in retrospect. Because it involved facial plates I don't read with full accuracy, and a register that may have been several things at once. What I can say is that it lasted about 3 seconds and then resolved into something more professionally neutral. He looked at Vethali. Field 22 of your intake form, he said. The reason for your arrival at this station. Yes, she said. You wrote that you were traveling to this station because this is the last operating intake point within range of your vessel's fuel capacity, and that your vessel's fuel capacity is at 7%, and that you have been attempting to file a welfare intake and transit permission request at stations in this sector for the purpose of re-registering your family's transit corridor access following the corridor reclassification of the 43rd cycle. Yes, Vethali said. The Vethali 7 transit corridor. Yes. He was quiet again. The Vethali 7 transit corridor is, or was, a secondary commercial and residential transit lane used primarily by independent Vethali family vessels for intrasystem travel and local commerce. It had been in continuous use for approximately 200 years. It was wide enough for standard family vessel configurations, well maintained, and ran through the inner system transit zones that make up the majority of the residential belt. Several hundred family homesteads were positioned along it. In the 43rd cycle, 11 years ago by Federation standard, it was reclassified as a restricted military approach lane by the Keth Station Directorate following a border incident with the Vethali systems that was, depending on which bulletin you read, either a proportionate defensive action or a significant overreach conducted without adequate consultation with affected residential communities, and the distinction between these two characterizations had never been formally resolved. The reclassification invalidated approximately 4,000 independent family vessel transit permits overnight, with no grace period and no alternative routing. The dispute had been in administrative review ever since. Administrative review, in this context, meant that it had been assigned to a committee, and the committee had been assigned a supervising administrator, and the supervising administrator had issued 3 preliminary position papers in 9 years, and the 3 preliminary position papers had produced 4 response filings from the Vel-Sareth Transit Coalition, and the 4 response filings had produced 2 supplementary position papers and 1 formal objection on procedural grounds. And none of this had produced an outcome, because the Directorate's position was that the reclassification had been made on security grounds, and the Transit Coalition's position was that security grounds did not override residential transit rights under Federation Charter. And both positions were held by people who had good reasons for them and very little incentive to move. In the meantime, 4,000 families had been navigating 11 years without the corridor. I knew all of this because I read the Directorate bulletins, every one going back to the incident that triggered the reclassification. I have been doing it for 22 years. The form tells you what happened to a person. The bulletin tells you the water they have been swimming in, and the water matters. The water tells you what is hard about the swim. I had read Field 22 and recognized the corridor name at 1423, approximately 40 minutes before I sent my preliminary filing notification. I had not said anything about it to any of the assessors who had arrived subsequently, because it was above my classification level and not my place to interpret, and because none of them had asked me, and because Vel-Sareth Rennick was answering every question put to her accurately, promptly, and completely, and the Field 22 answer was sitting there in the form, and someone would get there eventually. Deputy Chief Classification Officer Vel-Sareth Kem was looking at me. "You read Field 22 at intake," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I read all the fields at intake," I said. "That's the job." "Did you flag it specifically?" "I flagged the form as category undetermined. I noted I was awaiting guidance on classification. The Field 22 answer is in the form." He held the form for another moment. "Administrator Vel-Sareth Ren is currently on the observation level," he said. "He has been working through transit corridor administrative files this afternoon." I did not say anything. "He has been the supervising administrator for the Vel-Sareth 7 corridor reclassification review for 9 years, he said. "I know," I said. He looked at me. "Because you read the bulletins." "Because I read the bulletins," I said. He stood up from the assessment station. He picked up his tablet and the copy of my intake form. He looked at Vel-Sareth Rennick, who was watching him with the same careful steadiness she had maintained for the past 4.5 hours. He looked at Min, who had fallen asleep again, her head in her mother's lap, her hands relaxed for the first time since they had arrived. In sleep, she looked younger than 5 or 6. She looked the way all children look when they finally stop holding something carefully and let it go. "I'm going to go upstairs," Vel-Sareth Kem said to me. "All right," I said. He left. I finished my tea, which had gone cold. I want to be accurate about what happened next, because what happened next has been described in several subsequent documents in ways that I find somewhat embellished. The 87-page Directorate review, which was produced over the following 4 months, refers to the events of that evening as an inadvertent diplomatic contact of significant procedural consequence initiated through standard welfare intake processing. The Federation Intake and Welfare Division's internal report calls it a case study in foundational procedural resilience under conditions of classification ambiguity. The letter I received from the Transit Corridor Renegotiation Committee 6 months later, which I keep in my desk drawer rather than framing it, because the framing budget is not unlimited, calls it the proximate circumstance that reopened formal administrative contact between the parties after a period of 11 years. What actually happened was that Vel-Sareth Kem went upstairs and told Administrator Vel-Sareth Ren that there was a Vel-Sareth family vessel in the secondary intake corridor, with 7% fuel capacity, and a child asleep on the bench, and a welfare intake form that had stopped 4 classification officers in sequence, and that the intake clerk had been running standard welfare protocol since 1423 and had not escalated the corridor question specifically because she said it wasn't her place to interpret a case above her classification level. I do not know exactly what was said upstairs. I know what came downstairs. At 21:15, Administrator Velketh Sareth Aren came down to the secondary intake corridor. He was older than any of the other Directorate officials I had seen that afternoon, with the deep plate coloration of a senior Sareth administrative line that has spent a long time doing serious work, and the formal carry of someone who does not arrive anywhere without knowing what they are arriving for. He looked at the corridor. He looked at the potted plant. He looked at Vel Sareth Rennick, who had one hand resting on Min's sleeping shoulder, and was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting, in one form or another, for a very long time. He said something in Vethali that I did not understand. Vel Sareth Rennick looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something back in Vethali that I did not understand either, but that had the cadence of someone stating something simple and true. He sat down on the bench on the other side of Min. They talked in Vethali for 40 minutes. I did not interrupt. I filed my shift extension paperwork, which I had submitted at 20:03 when my relief called in ill, and updated my working log, and made the last pot of tea I could make, which was weak because I was nearly out of supply but was still tea, and put it on the table within reach and went back to my desk and let them talk. Min slept through all of it. She slept the way children sleep when they have been tired for too long and have finally found somewhere safe enough to let go, completely, without reservation, with her mouth slightly open and her hand still curled loosely around the strap of her bag. At 22:01, Administrator Velketh Sareth Aren stood up. He looked at Vel Sareth Rennick for a moment, and she looked back at him, and something was exchanged in that I am not going to describe because I don't have the vocabulary for it in any register. Then he looked at me. "Your shift ended at 20:00, he said. "My relief called in ill," I said. "I filed for the extension at 20:03. He looked at me for a long moment. I have been looked at by a great many people in 22 years of intake processing, in a great many registers, and I find that I can usually read what the look is doing. This one I could not read completely, but I thought it contained, somewhere in the middle of it, something like respect that didn't know quite how to present itself in this particular context. "The form," he said. I gave him my intake form. He read it. He read it the way someone reads a document they already know, looking for the specific thing they came to confirm. Then he did something I had not seen in 22 years of intake processing. He signed the bottom of the form, in the field that says, "Receiving Authority Clearance," which is a field that is supposed to be signed by a classification officer once a pathway has been determined, not by a senior administrator who has bypassed the classification process entirely. He signed it clearly, with his full administrative designation. He handed it back to me. "File it as received," he said. "Under what category?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "File it under the new one," he said. "We'll have the category designation to you by the end of the week." He left. I held the form for a moment. Then I filed it as received, category pending, noted that a designation would be forthcoming, and sent a copy to Vel Aren Sareth Kim with a routing flag and the time stamp. Then I went and gently woke Min, who came awake slowly and then quickly, the way children do, one moment deeply asleep and the next entirely present, looking up at me with clear amber eyes. "Are we staying?" she asked. "For now," I said. She nodded, very seriously. She picked up her bag, the heavy one, and stood up and walked to the door and waited, as though walking to a door and waiting was something she had done enough times to do it without being told. Vethali Rennick stood. She looked at me, and I don't know what she was going to say because she didn't say anything, but I understood it. I walked them down the corridor to the Welfare Transit Residential Wing, which has proper beds and a meal service, and a small playroom at the end of the hall that is used less than it should be. I handed them to the overnight duty officer, a good person named Yemi who has been doing overnight duty for 7 years and who took one look at Min, and said, in a tone that brooked no argument, that dinner was still available in the residential dining room and that they should come now. I went back to the secondary intake corridor and filed my end-of-shift report. The report was 8 fields. I completed them accurately, promptly, and completely, as I have been doing for 22 years. Then I locked up the secondary corridor and went home. What happened next happened without me, which is as it should be. I am an intake officer. I process arrivals and complete forms and make sure that people who have been in corridors for too long sit down somewhere safe. What happens after that is for other people. The Directorate review took 4 months. It was, by the standards of Directorate reviews, remarkably focused. The 87 pages covered the events of the shift in detail, the classification question and its resolution, the procedural gaps revealed by the case, and 3 sets of recommendations. The first set addressed the classification subcategory index and its failure to accommodate active administrative disputes affecting residential transit access. The second set addressed the welfare intake protocol for vessels with declared fuel emergencies. The third set addressed something the review called continuity of standard welfare care across classification escalation, which was a long way of saying that when a case gets escalated through 4 levels of assessment over several hours, someone should be making sure that the people at the center of the case continue to have somewhere to sit and something to eat, and that the escalation process does not become, in itself, a second ordeal. That third recommendation was the one that got the most internal circulation. I read several responses to it. One of them, from a classification review officer who had been at one of the other 17 stations, said that standard welfare protocol during active classification review was not currently a specified duty of the classifying officers and had never been raised as a gap before. I thought about what to say to this and eventually said nothing, because it was not my review to participate in and I had already been interviewed twice. The transit corridor renegotiation took 14 months after the review concluded. It produced an agreement that reinstated independent family vessel transit access through Vethali 7 under a new permit framework, established a permanent administrative review process for corridor reclassification disputes affecting residential transit vessels, and required the Keth Station Directorate to maintain an accessible welfare intake point for displaced corridor vessels for the duration of any future reclassification periods. I read all of this in the bulletin when it was published, sitting at my desk at the start of a Tuesday shift with my first cup of tea. Administrator Vethali signed the agreement. The Vethali Transit Coalition representative who signed on the other side was not Vethali Rennick, but was someone whose name I recognized from 4 of the prior administrative filings I had read over the years, which meant she had been working on this for at least 9 years and had not stopped. There is also a standing appointment now between the Chief Administrator's Office and Vethali Rennick on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. I learned this from Vethali Kim, who sent me a message 8 months after the shift with a subject line that said, "For your records," and no other text, just the meeting schedule attached as a file. I read the file. I saved it. I did not reply, because I could not think of a reply that was proportionate, and I have found over the years that when something is too large for a reply, it is better to let it sit quietly. I do not know what they discuss. I imagine some of it is administrative. I imagine some of it is not. The new category designation arrived from the Directorate 3 days after the shift, which was faster than the end-of-the-week Vel Keth Soreth Aren had mentioned. It is called Vel Soreth Welfare Intake, Corridor Displacement, Provisional, and it has its own section now in the Classification Subcategory Index, after Supplement 7, Revised. There is a note at the top of the section that says the field, Receiving Authority Clearance, should be completed by the senior administrator on duty when no standard classification pathway can be determined, and that standard welfare protocol should be maintained by the intake officer throughout the assessment escalation process, regardless of classification status. I did not write that note. I am told it was drafted by Vel Aren Sareth Kim from his field notes during the classification review. I am told he went through 3 versions before settling on this one. Vel Keth Sareth Ren, the first senior assessor who came down, sent me a message 2 weeks after the shift. It said, "I reviewed your form again. All 47 fields were accurately completed at the point of initial filing." In retrospect, the classification difficulty was entirely on our side of the desk. I read this several times. It is a precise and fair thing to say, and it costs something to say it. I sent a reply that said I appreciated it, and that I hoped her next Tuesday was quieter. She sent back a single Vethali character that indicates something between rueful agreement and mild irony. Min sent me a drawing. It arrived by station post 6 weeks after the shift, in an envelope from the Welfare Transit Residential Wing, on a piece of the pale yellow grid paper from the playroom supply. She had drawn 2 figures, one taller and one shorter, which I understood to be me and her based on relative height, and the fact that the taller figure was holding something that might have been a cup or a biscuit plate. It was not entirely clear. We were both smiling. There were dots above us that could have been stars or could have been other dots. In the bottom right corner, in careful Federation standard letters that were slightly uneven in size but clearly legible, she had written, "Thank you for the biscuits." I have it on my desk, next to the photograph of my daughter. I have been doing intake processing on Keth Soreth 9 for 22 years. The 4th commendation arrived 9 months after the shift and described, in the section titled Grounds for Award, what it called a demonstration of exceptional judgment under procedurally ambiguous circumstances. The full grounds section is 4 paragraphs. It mentions the accurate completion of all 47 form fields. It mentions the maintenance of standard welfare care across a 7.5-hour shift under conditions of escalating classification complexity. It mentions, in the final paragraph, that the intake officer identified the relevant administrative context from the content of Field 22 at the point of initial filing, and took no interpretive action beyond her classification level, while ensuring that the form reached the appropriate authority through standard escalation channels. I read this several times also. What it did not mention, and what I think is the more accurate account, is that I gave someone something to eat and sat with them while they waited, and made sure they were not more frightened than they needed to be. I did this because it is what the job is, underneath all the forms. The forms are how the job gets recorded. The sitting with people is how the job gets done. My colleague Benedict Sorensen-Lau read the 87-page Directorate review when it was circulated to intake staff, and came to my desk with it, and set it down in front of me and said, "You know what the funniest part of this is?" "What?" I said. "They spent 4 months writing a review about why you were right," he said, "and it still took them 87 pages to figure out how to say it." I thought about this. 87 pages is actually quite efficient for the Directorate, I said. He laughed. He went back to his desk. I poured my tea and picked up the day's intake forms and went back to work. It was Thursday. Thursdays are usually quieter than Tuesdays. I had a category pending form from the previous week that needed its designation, a fuel assistance request from a Vel Aren independent freighter. a standard residence renewal missing 2 supporting documents, and a new arrival in the secondary corridor. An elderly Keth man with a translation device that needed recalibration, and a housing transfer form he had filled in incorrectly in 3 fields. I checked on the category pending form first. The designation had come through at 0900. I filed it under Vel Sareth Welfare Intake Corridor Displacement, Provisional. The new classification pathway took about 40 seconds to apply. Then I went to the secondary corridor and helped the elderly man with his translation device, which needed recalibration at the 3rd frequency register, and his housing transfer form, which I corrected in the 3 fields and countersigned and sent through. He thanked me in Keth Sareth, which I have enough of to receive. I made him a cup of tea. He sat on the bench and drank it and looked at the potted plant, which was looking better than it had the week before. "Nice plant," he said. "It's a corridor fern," I said. "I've been watering it for 11 years. He nodded approvingly. I went back to my desk and noted the time, which was 10:23, and moved on to the next form.